From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture.
You'll appreciate from previous episodes that there's a little bit of nuance to selecting pollinator plants that can serve a broad spectrum of pollinators. But once in a while, there's a plant out there that really is a super plant that punches way above its weight, that serves as a real workhorse for supporting our pollinators. Leguminous plants certainly fit that bill. We've got a lot of native leguminous plants, for example. You can think of lupins or astragalus, but we have also a great many that are used for feed for livestock. Think of alfalfa, think about trefoil, think about the dizzying array of different clovers that are available. Those plants are super plants when it comes to the long-tongued bees, honeybees, but also the 25 or so species of bumblebees that we have in the state. To help us navigate the complicated agronomy of these leguminous plants, but also some of the other flowering forage plants that are used in livestock production, I invited Dr. Serkan Ates. He's my collaborator. We work together on a national honey board project with pasture land and pollinators. He's just across the street from me in the Department of Animal and Rangeland Sciences. He does a lot of remarkable work on pasture management here in Western Oregon. In this episode, he's going to tell us about all of these different legumes, how to grow them, how you can grow them. Thinking back to an episode we had with Bob Falconer where he had this crimson clover plot in his backyard. You can definitely do that. But he's also going to tell you about some of the lesser known plants, things that might bloom a little bit later, might fit your landscape. But also, if you're a livestock manager, how to really use these legumes to both help bees and pasture, what we call a dual use system. Hope you enjoy the episode. Okay, so I want to ask you, you know lots about forage plants. What's your favorite legume here in Western Oregon?
In Western Oregon, probably my favorite legume is birchwood trefoil from very many perspectives. First of all, birchwood trefoil can withstand the negative effect of the soil waterlogging type of the problems.
Oh, because here, this has been a really wet winter and there's been water pooling up.
In general, in Western Pacific, the Northwest, in winter we have a lot of rainfall, precipitation in general.
Yeah.
And in heavy clay soils, this often leads to waterlogging the situations.
So the trefoil can get really waterlogged and it's still growing. It's perennial.
Absolutely. It's a short-lived perennial crop.
Okay.
It has got beautiful yellow flowers in summer, and it can tolerate, again, the poorly drained soils. At the same time, with its deep taproot, it can also persist in summer dry type of environment. From these two perspectives, I think it makes a perfect environment for the birchwood trefoil to grow in Pacific Northwest.
Well, and so you mentioned it's a short-lived perennial. We have a lot of legumes. We grow a lot of legume seed here in Oregon. Tell us about some of the others, maybe some of the other perennials that are that you like.
I think we grow a lot of white clover for seed production in Pacific Northwest as well. And white clover is...
which is another short-lived perennial.
White clover can live actually quite a long time,
okay.
In pastures. It's a true perennial type of crop. It is mostly grown for grazing in grazing systems, not a sort of like a hay crop.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fantastic type of crop. It has got high nutritive value, and it can tolerate heavy, intensive grazing type of environment, and it can be grown together with the grasses really well.
Mm-hmm.
And it has got beautiful, the white top flowers in summer period, and which is really great for the pollinators too. When we take a look at the legumes in general, we know that alfalfa is just absolutely a fantastic crop, and it's grown extensively for hay production in Oregon and elsewhere in other parts of the world too. One of the things with alfalfa, however, it doesn't tolerate poorly drained soils, which is a big problem in Western Oregon, right? So we just don't easily grow alfalfa, except in some sort of like the really well drained the soils in here.
How about some of the annual clovers? Tell us a little bit about them.
Annual clovers can be grown for hay. Also, they can be grown in pastures in grazed type of systems. Specifically, there are different types of self-regenerating annual legumes, like subterranean clover, for example, which is very common in Pacific Northwest.
What self-regenerate? What do you mean by that?
Self-regenerating annual legumes, in a way that they behave like weeds in nature. Okay, so what they do is in fall, with the decent fall rainfall, they germinate.
Yeah.
And they establish themselves in the pastures.
Yeah.
Throughout the winter, they stay dormant, in the cold weather, and in early spring, they just, they'll suddenly grow so quickly because they have got, in general, lower temperature requirements as compared to very many perennial crop.
Okay.
So as annuals, they like to produce flowers, and then they wanted to produce seed. Ultimately, in summer, they die, and they spend the summer as seed in the soil.
Oh, so they kind of act like a perennial because they regenerate themselves.
Exactly.
But they're not. But technically, they're an annual plant. They got to set seed to be able to get the next.
Absolutely, they produce lots of hard seeds, and they put them in the soil. And those hard seeds probably depending on the variety and the type of crop, 10 to 50% of those seeds can germinate in the next fall. Some of those hard seeds can stay in the soil for up to 20 years.
Well, and so you mentioned subterranean clover, and you and I have talked extensively. Subterranean clover doesn't offer any benefits to bees. It's one of those clovers that I didn't know this, but some of these clovers really don't have a lot of flowers right up top.
Absolutely. Subclover, from the animal production perspective or pasture production perspective, it's an excellent alternative to white clover, because white clover, it doesn't tolerate really dry environments much because it has got shallow roots. But subclover, with this drought escape strategy, spending summer as seed in the soil, which is called drought escape strategy. It's just the fantastic. But like you said, subclover produces really, the small type of white flowers, and most of those, the white flowers is sort of covered under the canopy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that most of the bees do not easily access to these, the small flowers. That's probably one of the the limitations of subclover from the pollinator's perspective.
Okay, but we do have annual clovers that do give a lot of flowers that are self-regenerating. Tell us a little bit about them.
Absolutely. One of the other legumes that's really my favorite is Balansa clover.
Valencia. Okay.
Yeah. Balansa clover is grown extensively in dry areas of Australia. I think, if I'm not wrong, more than 5 million hectare land at the moment is grown only with Balansa clover. Yes.
Okay.
The beauty of this crop, like burswood trefoil, it can tolerate waterlogging environment really well. In the poorly drained soils, it can grow extremely well. And it's like an ice cream for the livestock too, because livestock love Balansa clover, regardless of the cattle, the class of the animals, cattle, the sheep, the geese, duck, whatever you think, they would just extremely like Balansa clover. It's a self-regenerating annual legume. In terms of its reproductive strategy, it's a little bit different than subclover. Subclover, or the subterranean clover, tend to bury its seeds into the soil. That's why they call it subterranean clover. Yeah.
So that it makes a flower, it sets a seed, and then it
like
a peanut.
Yeah, exactly like a peanut, and it just buries its seeds into the soil. And from this perspective, it's just really, really successful crop under grazing environment because its seeds are protected, right? Balansa clover, on the other hand, it has got a different strategy. It generally produce so many copious amount of the small seeds, and those seeds they can be dispersed in the soil. Or even the animals they eat basically Balansa clover seeds. Most of those seeds can pass through the gastrointestinal the tract of the animals.
Yeah.
So once the animals defecate those seeds are still viable. Okay. So Balansa clover, from this perspective, actually produces top flowers above the canopy, which is really great for the the pollinators.
Yeah.
But at the same time, those seeds once they are mature, they can exactly survive through the GI tract of the animals.
Okay.
And again, it's a very the palatable type of crop for the animals. It's really useful for the pollinators. From the in the agroecological conditions of Pacific Northwest, which is the dry in summer and wet in winter period of time, Valencia clover suits this type of environment really well.
Okay, so thanks for that little rundown on some of the annual and perennial clovers that you really like. And I guess we should return here to Western Oregon. So you are you deal with pasture management, and so what's the common system of pasture that, let's say, somebody with sheep would have here in Oregon? What does it look like?
First of all, when we think about the pastures,
the one thing that I remember you telling me, you were telling about regenerating clover, but here it's typically people use a non-regenerating system. Describe that system to us.
Yeah. So for the high input dairy system, the typical type of the pastures are composed of perennial ryegrass white clover combination. And it's just the perfect the combination high input the temperate type of the irrigated agroecologies.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the farmers like to add a little bit summer active type of crops like orchard grass, sometimes chicory and plantain, just to diversify.
Okay.
In diverse type of mixtures. And this is just perfect. In dryland type of environment, mostly the farmers tend to grow tall fescue, and it's mostly tall fescue dominated type of pastures. Sometimes you can see white clover here and there, and subterranean clover as well. This highly successful in dryland environment too. You can see this subterranean clover with tall fescue and sometimes with orchard grass in those pastures. This is really typical in Pacific Northwest, even some other temperate areas of the world.
Mm-hmm.
The main issue when you think about the this dryland type of environment, nitrogen for the pasture production is really important, and for the plant growth. And one of the the nitrogen is the most limiting the nutrient for the pasture production as well. In particular, dryland type of pasture, this is a big problem. You can, of course, add chemical fertilizer, but chemical fertilizer sometimes can be costly, especially if it is a sort of the higher hill country type of environment in those difficult terrain. It's a little bit difficult to apply chemical fertilizer as well. The beauty of the legumes, they can fix the atmospheric nitrogen into the soil through their symbiotic type of relationship with the soil bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
And that nitrogen can be, used by the grasses and increase the overall pasture, the quality for sure. And the other benefit of legumes, the animal like to graze legumes. They prefer over, the grasses, mm-hmm. and they can increase their dry matter intake and productivity at the same time. Of course, the legumes from the, the pollinator perspective, they produce the beautiful flowers, a lot of the pollens for the pollinators. Yeah.
Well, and I remember you mentioning that in a lot of systems, even though they're using something like subclover, they're not. First of all, that when they're not irrigated, they dry to a crisp by May,
June. Yeah,
but that oftentimes they have to reset. They end up reseeding. They're not getting the regeneration.
Of course, the farmers do not like to spend money on the seeds, right? Mm-hmm. So sometimes you can see that the many of these pastures, through the time they become really grass dominated pastures. And sometimes legumes like subterranean clover, some of those other type of the grasses aside from the tall fescue can be dominated the pastures.
Mm-hmm.
Subclover is really successful since it buries its seeds into the soil in this dryland environment. Unless the farmers come renovate their pastures with the new the pasture species, some the more diverse type of the pasture species. In that case, this is just a very typical type of the pastures in Oregon. But with regeneration, like I mentioned, the farmers like to utilize the plantain, chicory type of, the forbs, because they're really summer active, the highly nutritive type of forage. And white clover, they like to add white clover in their mixtures, which is really great crop as well. Another crop that we haven't mentioned so far is red clover. Red clover is mostly grown for hay, and in Pacific Northwest as well, it has got high potential too. It's also a short-lived perennial, but it's a beautiful, beautiful type of crop as well, and we grow in the valley, I believe, for seed production quite a lot too.
Well, it does raise this question. So, and I think this sets up some of the research that you've been doing with pollinators.
Yeah.
So the most pasture systems that are not irrigated are these subclover annual systems, and they may reseed and be able to regenerate themselves, but that there is this period in the summer where these pastures go dry, and in some case that land is just sitting there idle waiting for the rain. Tell us a little bit about perennial clovers and also other perennial forages that you've been experimenting in putting into these. I guess the idea is in some of these subclover systems, if you had these other plants growing, when that dries down, these deep-rooted perennials would then sprout back up.
Yeah. Of course, summer slump is a big problem for many.
Summer slump.
Yeah, that's what they normally call it,
Okay.
Because of the deficiency of the forages. Sometimes the farmers tend to to grow cover crops or the summer active type of crops like sorghum, Sudan grass, and things like that, or sometimes the brassicas, sometimes like turnips in the different types of the parts of their pastures or the fields. They can be irrigated. They can also, some of them can grow in dryland type of environment. What we wanted to investigate in some of our studies, we wanted to see what we can grow in dryland type of environment as an alternative to alfalfa. Like I mentioned, at the beginning of our conversation, alfalfa is a fantastic crop. It can grow really, the dry environments, really cold environments. It's widely adapted to very many parts of the world, right? Mm-hmm. But again, it doesn't like the poorly drained soils. So we wanted to to see what can be grown as an alternative to alfalfa in summer in dryland environment. So in our study, we planted birchwood trefoil, we planted chicory, we planted red clover, we planted sainfoin, and also we wanted to look at their combinations with the annual crops, like annual forages like subterranean clover and balansa. Mm-hmm. Many of these crops, of course, they have got high potential for the pollinators too. We wanted to look at their, their basically the potential for the pollinators.
Okay, so just let me stop here for a sec. So all of these plants, so as you say, so the basic idea is that when you think about something like alfalfa, alfalfa will stay green in the dry months because it has a deep root, and so you get this foliage that you can then hay off in the summer.
Yep.
It doesn't grow here, and so you were testing these alternatives to alfalfa, and one of them that you mentioned that was kind of curious. I was thinking, okay, I've heard of red clover.
Yep.
I've heard of trefoil now, but two that maybe our listeners hadn't heard of are chicory.
Chicory, yes.
Chicory. They're growing chicory as something that livestock like to eat.
Chicory is a fantastic crop. It's not really suitable for hay production system, to be perfectly honest. It's really good for grazing, and sometimes it can be the silage basically, and sile. In the bale silage kind of situations. Chicory is a pasture herb. It has got high nutritive value, and it has got some secondary metabolites which helps secondary metabolites that has got antimicrobial type of effect.
Oh, so the sheep that would eat it, if
sheep
they had
or cattle,
it would help them kind of get over something.
Yeah, sometimes it helps the parasites, drenching the parasites. It boosts their immune systems. It makes the animals healthier in a way.
Because of tonight.
Exactly. Very very many people actually like to include this type of forbs in their own the diets, right? In the human beings eat them. like plantain, for example, chicory, endive. These are all like really, the some of the like the food or the feed stuff that we like to consume for our health. Yeah.
Well, and I think many people know chicory because it has that really distinctive. It's the late summer plant.
Yes.
And it has that really deep
Taproot. Yeah.
purple. Well, the deep taproot, but also a purple flower. And it seems to grow here in Oregon at a very dry time of year.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Again, the chicory is also very like the successful crop in dryland environments, and it has got like the higher summer growth. And in summer, basically, when you like hit the summer slump, if you see something like really green and high quality, the forage, you like it, and that's part of the reason why very many farms like they include chicory in their pastures, right? And at the same time, like you said, chicory has got beautiful purple flower. It flowers like throughout the summer period.
The other one that you mentioned that I'm familiar of from work in Lethbridge when I was up there, but was sandfoin.
Yes.
So what's sandfoin?
Sandfoin is a fantastic legume. Possibly it can provide everything you can expect from a forage legume. It tolerates extreme cold weather. It tolerates extreme hot weather. It's a short-lived perennial. It doesn't persist as long as alfalfa does. It just probably stays green 3-4 years, and then the entire the forage stand collapse. Sandfoin, you can safely graze by the animal. For example, it has got something called condensed tannins, and those condensed tannin doesn't cause it prevents bloat for the animals.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it has got beautiful the flowers. Basically, the pollinators, the bees, for example, love them. And it has got some of those anti-helminthic compounds, which that helps again the parasite drenching in the animals.
Gotcha.
So.
Okay, so and one thing that you mentioned that I think would be good for, I'm thinking of this episode as a crash course for bee conservationists who want to know something about legumes. And I guess one thing that comes up with legumes is that some of them cause bloat.
Yeah.
What is bloat?
Bloat is a kind of like a situation for the ruminant animals. Sometimes, especially this is the case for alfalfa, for example, there are different type of the compounds in these forages. When the animal consume, especially the very quick, the rate and high amounts, and then these the forages cause frothy bloat, or sort of like a foamy, substances in the rumen, and this foamy the substance. It just prevents animals to burp and belch, just to basically get rid of the gas inside the rumen. So, and then suddenly the rumen starts to swell up.
Okay, so there's something in the forage that causes the bubbles.
Yep, exactly.
And that traps the gas from getting out.
Yep, exactly.
Be darned.
Yeah.
Okay.
So alfalfa is typically notorious from this perspective. But the crops like birch with trefoil and sandfoin, since they have got this condensed tannin, which prevents the bloat occurring in the
Pops
rumen.
the bubbles somehow.
Exactly. Yeah, it prevents this frothy the bubbles happening.
I'll be darned.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So from this perspective, again, the sandfoin is perfect, but like alfalfa, it doesn't tolerate really poorly drained soils. So that's a very big difficulty for sandfoin to grow in Pacific Northwest. But in Eastern Oregon, for example, or in highland environment like Colorado, Wyoming, it's just a perfect type of the crop.
Okay, so that was a little bit of a detour, but just before we take a break, I just want to set up this experiment. So you have an experiment was funded by National Honey Board.
Yeah.
And it was over in Lebanon, just up the road here from Corvallis. You had some plots. Describe what you the control, I guess. The basic thing you were testing.
We wanted to keep the alfalfa as the control crop in here. Although alfalfa cannot persist in poorly drained soils, the site that we planted these forages, they still have relatively better drainage, a little bit higher alkaline type of, not alkaline soils, but higher pH type of soils, which was close to 6.5, which alfalfa can tolerate.
Okay.
So we wanted to again to test other alternative crops in other alternative crops in this environment. So we planted chicory, we planted red clover, sainfoin, burswood trefoil as a monoculture together with alfalfa, or their combination with either subterranean clover or balansa clover.
So that would be those two, the
subclover and balansa. They are the self-regenerating annual legumes.
And that's what most people in the valley would do for non-irrigated pasture.
Non-irrigated pastures, these, the two legumes, they are very common in, the perennial pasture systems. Yeah.
So you do them on their own, and then you'd sort of, you'd also seed in or on monoculture these perennial forages.
Yep.
And then I guess the next thing is to answer the livestock question, how much, I guess,
forage production, seasonal forage production, we can produce from these forages. That's what we did. And we harvested these forages a couple times in spring and early summer. Then we let these forages to flower and produce the sunflower throughout the summertime before our the final harvest. And we look at from the pollinator perspective, what is their the potential of these different the crops. Yeah.
Okay. All right, that sets us up. Let's take a quick break, and then we're going to come back, and you can tell us the results of this experiment, and if there's some, I guess the idea is if there's a dual-use system, a system that can help both livestock and bees at the same time. Hey, we're back. So talking about, with Dr. Serkan Ates, we're talking about sheep and bees. So these plots I remember them because I was working with you on this. So they got harvested. They got harvested once in the spring. So simulating the sheep going in and munching down the foliage.
Or in another way, harvesting them for hay production.
Okay, and so you took that off, and then you went back, and then you did another harvest, sort of in May.
Yeah.
And then the valleys, what'd you call it again? It got dry. It's called the what?
Summer slump.
Summer slump set in.
Yeah.
And so...
Or onset of the drought conditions, basically.
So describe what those subclover, sort of the status quo kind of pastures look like on beginning of June.
Yeah. Basically, in those pastures, tall fescue still grow in summer periods. Although, the quality decreases, the growth rate decreases. Tall fescue is a fantastic, the grass from that perspective. But all the annual legumes die out. For sure. Okay. They are dead because they complete their life cycle. Before the onset of the drought, they wanted to produce the flowers, they want to produce the seed, and then they shut the shop, and then they die.
So from a livestock perspective, you're getting off that piece of land, you're getting no legume production until it rains again.
Yep, that's correct. Unless there are some the white clover which can persist sometimes in high quality soils in a little bit higher rainfall environment. Okay. But in most cases, yes, legumes just generally, the annual legumes, do not tolerate that type of the environment. Yeah.
So what did the plots with the perennials in them look like after this point?
Alfalfa and red clover still were very productive, and although burswood trefoil in early spring didn't produce much, later in summer it just came back really strong. That's one of the issues with burswood trefoil. Very many farmers, they love burswood trefoil in Pacific Northwest, but at the same time, it's very difficult to establish this crop, right? Mm-hmm. But once it's established, it's just perfect.
So unlike the other forages, because presumably the sandfoin and let's say the alfalfa and the red clover, they produced a lot of mass in those first two harvests.
Yeah.
And they came back, but the burswood trefoil actually in some ways had its best months in the middle of summer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And it was a little bit the same case for chicory too. But burswood trefoil from that perspective, produced really impressive amount of the forage in late summer.
Okay, so these plants grew up, and then I guess that, because at this time it would be closed to grazing because it's too dry, these plants, did they flower?
They just did flower, actually. They produce a lot of flowers, specifically the perennials, right? Mm-hmm. Because both balansa clover and subterranean clover, they finish flowering sometimes in early June, not early June, actually late May. Mm-hmm. And then, the perennials took off, like red clover has a lot of, the flowers. Sainfoin has got so many flowers, but the problem with the sainfoin, it didn't establish well in this, high rainfall environment.
Mm-hmm.
Birds with trefoil produce so many copious amount of the beautiful yellow flowers too.
Mm-hmm.
And chicory, chicory the much better than me from the flowering perspective, and they just had a lot of flowers throughout the the summer period.
And the two of us, we're going to be writing this up for Bee Culture sometime in the next few months. We're going to be submitting sort of an article that you listeners can actually read the article. But the one thing I do remember was there was kind of like a pulse. After that last harvest, the first thing that happened was the bird's foot trefoil really bloomed. And then it kind of waned. And then the red clover and the chicory bloomed. And
yeah.
the chicory bloom was so impressive.
Yeah.
Remember when we would walk through those plots, it was just really, the bees were just mobbing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it has got beautiful purple flowers and, top flowering type of plant, of course. And it's just really, really useful for the pollinators, I believe. And from these crops, that was what it is initially, they intrigued me. I mean, we are using extensively for the animal production. But at the same time, they have got so many ecosystem benefits as well. Pollinator is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they have got different potentials for different types of pollinators. That's exactly what we wanted to see. What is their potential in Pacific Northwest in a sort of the adaptive management. If we manage these in the forages, both for livestock at the same time for the pollinators or wildlife, right?
Well, so I guess this is the other thing that we talked about, is that there are these benefits back to the bees, for example. So otherwise, this land would be just crisp and dry, just with fescue growing through.
Yeah.
And now you have these flowers in the landscape that weren't there before. And the other thing that you mentioned is that you can get the flowering, and then in August, the lambs, if you're dealing with lambs, for example, with sheep, for example, they actually do need some food, and you can go down and graze it again.
Of course.
So you let the flowers grow up, and then you put the sheep in at the end of August.
Absolutely. I can talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, why is it important for
the livestock?
If we're thinking about sheep production and sort of when they're giving birth and stuff in Western Oregon, how does that cycle overlay with this?
First of all, I wanted to make something clear. When we talk about the grasses, it's not the possible to alternate the grasses with the legumes for sure, because grasses produce so much of the forages and they are more persistent.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to do from the livestock perspective, trying to incorporate legumes into, the grass systems more or the pasture systems more. But when it comes to the sheep production systems, what happens in Oregon, for example, the lambs are mostly are born either sort of in winter period of time or sometimes in early spring period of time. The ones that are born in winter, some of them are turned out to these the grass seed, especially the annual ryegrass seed fields. So they graze a couple months, and then some of them are then moved on to the legume the fields for the legume seed production.
If we're driving around the valley right now, you'll see a grass seed field, and there'll be sheep on it. So they're grazing.
Absolutely.
Okay, so
absolutely.
So these are, when we look at them, those sheep are pregnant right now.
Some of them are the already lambed. They just they gave birth to their lambs. Yeah, for sure. And some of them are pregnant at the moment.
Okay.
And of course, the many people just keep them on their the field. They just provide a little bit of supplemental type of forages. They don't have to be always on the the grass seeds for sure. But again, those lambs, the lambs are the main crops of the sheep farms. So they need to be bring them to the slaughter weights, and then get some cash for the farms. So again, the basic the problem in the winter and spring, of course, there are the forages available, but summer, mostly if it is still dry land, the pastures are supplemented with the alfalfa hay. Those animals actually supplemented with alfalfa hay just to bring them.
So the pastures go dry.
Yes.
And so then they have to import hay from probably Eastern Oregon.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
They just provide the alfalfa hay to those animals just to keep the live weight gains higher.
Okay.
Sometimes they can to put those animals on crops like the cover crops I mentioned. Sometimes turnip type of brassicas.
Yeah.
Because they also to produce high nutritive value forages or something like chicory, right? But in general, the legumes, they have got higher quality than grasses, and most importantly, with the maturity, increasing maturity, they can retain their high quality. So what we think is, okay, we can incorporate these legumes into pastoral systems.
Yeah.
In early spring, doesn't really matter if it is the cattle or the lambs or the sheep, they can graze this high quality forage, and you can still keep the the live weight gains of animals lamb growth can be still high.
Mm-hmm.
And in summer, you can still put them on normal pastures and supplement with the alfalfa. But before finishing off, you can stockpile some of these legumes in throughout the summer period of time, and in the late summer, early fall, you can put your lambs into these high quality forages, and you can finish them off at probably at a lower the cost of feeding. And throughout this period, when you think about it, for the pollinators, when is the the most limiting months in terms of their pollen sources?
Yeah.
It's just July, August, right?
So dry. It's so
So
dry.
dry.
Here.
Yeah. These legumes, once you close those pastures, in May, they can still produce a little bit of the forage, and at the same time they will start flowering.
Yeah.
So during, let's say, July, early August period of time, they can produce a lot of the flowers for the animals. And then they can serve the stockpile type of the legumes can serve for the benefit of the lambs or the cattle in some cases.
Yeah. Okay, so these would have been born. So these would have been born in the middle of summer or something.
No,
The lambs.
the lambs are always born in January, February, sometimes March.
Okay.
In late winter, early spring period of time.
Yeah.
And they stay with their moms for about 3 months.
Yeah.
They to get the milk, and they get used to grazing the pastures,
Yeah.
right? And then afterwards, the lambs are weaned.
Yeah.
They just get separated from their mothers.
Yeah.
They still need to maintain their high growth rates, because you need to bring them to the slaughter weight.
All right. Oh, so they're born in those months, and then it's in the summer that you have to grow them up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
yeah.
so you hit this problem where you just don't have anything. So you end up, a farmer has to bring in all this hay
Supplemental
to get those weights up. But if you stop, what you said is if you will let this pasture with these perennials plugged in grow up,
Yeah.
flower, and then they'll feed the bees.
Yep.
And then when the bees are stopped feeding, then you put these lambs in, and then that allows them to sort of cut their hay costs.
Yep.
And they can use that to grow the lambs.
Absolutely. And yeah, and this is going to be our next project together with you. We wanted to develop a system that would just the more efficient for the farmers, from the livestock producers. And at the same time, we wanted to see, again, these different types of the options. What would be the implications on the pollinators, for example? Yeah, it's an exciting project for sure.
Just a quick thing, because I'm sure some of our listeners here in Oregon are kind of curious. Why are those grass seed fields? You imagine that you need the plant to grow the seed. Why on earth would you put sheep in there?
That's a good question. First of all, one of the benefits of livestock, especially light livestock like sheep, you can graze those excess of forage material in, during cool season, late winter, early spring period, and get that excess of foliage from the field. The second important thing is the effect of grazing or the defoliation on pastures in general, they increase tillering capacity of the plants. So you can produce more dense type of the field.
Oh, so they'll fill in little gaps. The plant,
Absolutely,
it's like, I'm not going to grow up, I'm going to get eaten, and then it goes sideways.
Absolutely, they produce more tillers, from that perspective. And of course, those tillers they increases the seed production.
Oh, so the grass seed growers actually
benefit from this.
It's, I guess, another dual use system
Yep.
where the sheep, you're able to feed the sheep, but then also increase seed production because you're just making a much more productive base.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'll be
That's
darned.
the main cause, yeah. Of course, you need to manage this system well. You need to know when to close those pastures, what would be the stocking rate, how close you should be grazing in winter as well, right?
Here's the last question I want to ask you. I didn't ask you this in the questions I prepared for you in advance, but let's say you are a homeowner, let's say you have a small acreage and you want to grow legumes just for bees in the spring. Let's say you wanted to make a nice vigorous Valencia stand or a crimson clover stand. What time of year do you establish it? What's the best time? Do you do it in the spring or?
I would mostly plant these legumes in fall. You can plant them in early spring as well if you can, if the soil conditions let you do that. And if you have got the irrigation, that's a possibility as well. But most of these, the annual legumes, they are planted in fall, early fall time.
So they'll sprout up. So
they
you
sprout
do
up,
early fall, enough for them to grow. Then it gets cold, and I guess they just sit there waiting.
Yeah, they sit there waiting. They are dormant in winter period of time, very inactive. But in early spring, again, they just they grow so sudden, so quickly. And then the only thing that those, the plants, when they think, they think that at the end of the summer, I'm going to die. Before I die, I need to produce my foliage. I need to produce flowers, and I need to produce seed for my next generation, I guess, right? So that's what they do. In early spring, they grow really fast. They flower, and then they die.
Is it the same with perennial legumes? You do establish in the fall?
Perennial legumes can be established in spring, and they can be established in fall as well. Spring establishment depends on in the conditions, the soil conditions when you can establish, and if you have got irrigation, because summer is quite dry in here, so you wanted to ensure successful establishment of those crops. You can definitely establish them in spring as well if you got a little bit of irrigation.
And which is the easiest legume to grow for somebody who's just starting out?
I think I would just to go for a sort of a diverse legume mixture, especially if it is for pollinators. I would definitely go for crimson clover, for example. Crimson clover is very easy to establish and very winter active type of crop. So many of those, in the farmers, they add crimson clover in their cover crops. I would just add definitely Balenza clover in my mixture if it is an annual type of the stand. And the other two interesting crops are Persian clover and Berseem clover.
You talked a little bit. No, you haven't talked about.
I haven't talked about Persian and the Berseem clover.
Tell us about them.
Persian clover and Berseem clover, they tend to flower a little bit later in spring.
Oh.
Yeah, Balenza clover and crimson clover comes the first, and then Balenza clover afterwards. And Berseem and Persian clover, they're a little bit in the warmer season active type of legumes, annual legumes. Yeah. Actually, another interesting one is arrowleaf clover. We just did one in the video, the session with the arrowleaf, if you remember.
Yeah, if you go on our Facebook page, you'll see this really dense arrowleaf stand.
Absolutely. Arrowleaf is the same. It just comes a little bit later in spring. But of course, the problem with the arrowleaf is just, the same with alfalfa and sainfoin. It doesn't tolerate waterlogged type of situations much. But on the other hand, Persian clover and Balenza clover, they just really flourish in this type of, the environment. They can tolerate poorly drained soil, waterlogged type of soil, and then summer dry conditions because of their drought escape strategy.
And they're all three of those are like a white flower.
They can be different, Balenza clover, sort of the white, pinkish, the type of crimson clover, of course, from the name. It has got beautiful red, the flowers.
They're huge, yeah.
And Persian clover, if you walk into, in the field with this clover, and if something is smelling like perfume, it's most probably, Persian.
Really?
Yeah. Persian,
nice.
The clover, just flower is just so beautiful, like a perfume. And like Balenza clover, it tolerates waterlogging really well. But as compared to Balenza clover, it's not a self-regenerating annual legume because it doesn't produce these hard seeds. So it's only the soft seeds. So you can only see Persian clover once or 2 years in a row, and then, not much afterwards.
This is an interesting thing, and if we take a sidetrack here, because hard and soft seed, I think, is a key issue, is that for a lot of people, the one thing you notice with legumes is they're in every ditch.
Yeah,
they flew off a hay pile 50 years ago, and that they reseed vigorously, and they're just difficult to get out. But I guess soft seeds are very easy to get out.
Yep. Absolutely. Like, the many of those soft-seeded, like, the crops, if you kill them, let's say, by harvesting them before, the seed set, or with the, like, the chemicals, it will be very difficult for those plants to, keep persisting in that environment, because in the soil, there is no seed bank, right?
So Persian clover is one of these that is a soft seeded one. So even if it drops seed down, it won't accumulate.
Yeah, it won't accumulate. Yeah.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, and the same thing for berseem clover, for example. Berseem clover is one of those subtropical type of, the clover species.
Uh-huh.
But in Oregon, that's what I like about, the Oregon. There are so many, like, the progressive type of, the farmers, seed companies here. They develop this balança clover, they develop this berseem clover. Now we have got available cold-tolerant berseem clover variety in here, which is called frosty berseem clover. So you can, like, grow in, like, the colder environment like this, but it's a subtropical type of, the legume. And in summer, throughout the entire summer period, it will just, like, keep growing and flowering up until September even. So it's a fantastic crop.
And we should say that last year we did a seed mix together that we'll be doing again this year. So if you're in Oregon, you may in one of our events you might see this. We have a seed mix that has a number of these annual clovers in, so you can watch them.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you for giving us a crash course in clover. We really appreciate it, and legumes and forages, and we're really looking forward to the what happens in the next round of your project. It sounds like a really great opportunity to put some bee food in the landscape at a time of year that it's really difficult.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Anthony.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sinan Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.